All right, I think I'm going to start. And wish you all good afternoon. I'm Samuel Immersion, Director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. And it's really my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Jeremy Walton. Jeremy is the Jamal Daniel Postdoctoral Fellow for the Study of the Levant here at the CCAS. And prior to joining us, he was Assistant Professor and Faculty Fellow in New York University's Religious Studies program from 2009 to 2012. He received his PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago in 2009 and is currently in the process of writing and revising his book manuscript entitled Pieties of Pluralism, Formations of Islam, Liberalism, and Secularism in Turkey. His talk today is entitled Civil Mediations of Piety and Community, Secularism, Liberalism, and New Islamic Humanism in Contemporary Turkey. And I wish to thank the Levant Foundation for making possible Jeremy's research appointment at CCS. And I hope it's been as fruitful for Jeremy as it has been for us. And the postdoctoral fellowships for the study of the Levant support for one academic year 2 recent PhDs whose academic interests focus on the region defined as the Levant defined as Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, and Turkey. I want to thank you all for attending, and please join me now in welcoming Professor Jeremy Walton.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Osama. I've been anticipating this presentation for several months now, and I'm so happy to be able to share with all of you some of the directions in which I'm taking my research at the moment. Thanks to you for attending, especially on such a nice day when you could be outside enjoying your lunch in the suddenly summer-like weather. I'm afraid I have made some changes to my title, as is the prerogative of the speaker. So I'll actually it still says the original title on my own notes, but I'm now titling this presentation as Mediations of Piety and Community, Statism, Populism, and Liberal Humanism in Contemporary Turkey. And we'll see why I've made that change, hopefully. I'd also like to express my deep gratitude and thanks to both Jamal Daniel himself and to the Levant Foundation for making my year-long residency here possible. It's been, I can say without a doubt, an extraordinary intellectual and social experience, and I can't also thank my colleagues here at CCAS enough. With that, I'll begin. A few caveats to the talk. As most anthropologists at one point or another do, I've been grappling recently with how to best integrate the disparate and indeed often anomalous experiences of my fieldwork in Turkey with the broader theoretical concerns of the discipline and indeed across disciplines. And so in trying to do that, of course, anthropologists have long grappled with this issue, but in trying to do that, I'm exploring some new ways of presenting my research, and I'm going to use one of those for you today. Namely, I'm going to be presenting 5.5 or 6 ethnographic anecdotes, and then in a somewhat less formal fashion, and I'll be reading those, but in a less formal fashion, I'll be sort of discussing what I find interesting and provocative about these vis-a-vis the concerns of my research generally. So we'll have anecdotes and then sort of elaboration. I'd also like to make a caveat and say that in fact, as I was preparing this presentation, which in some sense is a version of the introductory chapter of my book manuscript, I realized that in fact I wasn't going to be talking about my primary object of research much at all. So I wanted to let you know that that's partially why I changed the title of the presentation. My fieldwork in Istanbul and Ankara and elsewhere in Turkey lasted from 2005 to 2007, and I focused primarily on different civil Islamic organizations, NGOs, vakıflar, and dernekler, or foundations and associations in the Turkish, that have emerged over the past quarter century or so since the liberalization of Turkish law following the coup of 12 September 1980. And I was interested in particular in 3 communities, which I will discuss a little bit today, namely the Nur Cemaatı, or the community surrounding and dedicated to the theology of the deceased theologian Bediuzzaman Said Nursi, The Gülen Hareketi, or Hizmet, as it's now, I think, more frequently known, which focuses on one of Said Nursi's own followers and disciples, Fethullah Gülen. I'm sure many of you have encountered Mr. Gülen. He's, well, maybe not personally, but his organizations and activities have indeed almost metastasized on a global level. So he lives in the Poconos, strangely enough, in Pennsylvania. We can discuss that in the question and answer if you like. And then finally, also Turkish Alevis, who fashioned themselves indeed as a civil society movement, but also in a sort of more traditional civil rights movement way, as a minority community seeking representation and recognition, representation by and recognition from the state. Turkish Alevis, very briefly, it's difficult to have numbers because indeed they're not an officially recognized category by the Turkish state, but they constitute approximately 5 to 20% of the population, and they synthesize the sort of theological principles of 12 of Shi'a Islam, Jafari Islam as it's known in Turkey, with a variety of heterodox, at least from the Sunni perspective, ritual practices. They don't pray in mosques. They have a gem ceremony, as they call it. So these were the groups that I actually focused on. This is all by way of a long introduction here that I focused on. But in this paper today, I'm actually giving something of a prolegomenon to all of that, trying to lay out through these different anecdotes and also through the metaphor of topography or geography, the entire sort of span of what I'm taking on in my research. So that's what I'm doing for you today. And in some sense, it's helping me to rethink all of these issues, and hopefully you'll find it provocative as well. So that's the first introduction, I guess. The second introduction, I have 3 guiding quotations that I want us to keep in mind. And this will sort of frame my research vis-a-vis my main interlocutors, in particular the anthropology of Islam and secularism, as it's come to be known in recent years, affiliated with and inspired by the work of Talal Asad especially. So I'll begin with this quotation from Asad. What is a tradition? A tradition consists essentially of discourses that seek to instruct practitioners regarding the correct form and purpose of a given practice that, precisely because it is established, has a history. These discourses relate conceptually to a past when the practice was instituted, and from which the knowledge of its point and proper performance has been transmitted, and a future, how the point of that practice can best be secured in the short or long term, or why it should be modified or abandoned, through a present, how it is linked to other practices, institutions, and social conditions. An Islamic discursive tradition is simply a tradition of Muslim discourse that addresses itself to conceptions of the Islamic past and future, with reference to a particular Islamic practice in the present. Clearly, not everything that Muslims say and do belongs to an Islamic discursive tradition, nor is an Islamic discursive tradition in this sense necessarily imitative of what was done in the past. For even where traditional practices appear to the anthropologist to be imitative of what has gone before, it will be the practitioner's conceptions of what is apt performance and of how the past is related to the present practices that will be crucial for tradition, not the apparent repetition of an old form. Yeah, you'll note that this was in fact from a lecture delivered in this very room, I imagine, and I'm not sure what the vintage of this room is, but at CCAS. It wasn't for that reason that I chose it to begin the talk, but it is, I think, a nice precedent, establishing myself in a sort of discursive tradition, if you will. This is from 1986. Thinking about this a little bit, and this is now the theoretical portion of my paper. I welcome those of you who might not be as interested in the anthropology of secularism and Islam and the Assadian arguments to perhaps close your ears for a moment. Not close your ears, but just to frame explicitly theoretically what I'm doing. The Assad quote that I've just written has been taken up, and I think it's become quite famous from that lecture here at CCAS, among anthropologists of Islam and secularism. And people tend to focus on the first half of the quotation, namely this definition of a discursive tradition linking past, future, and present in this supple way. And it rightly so that people have taken up this definition. I think it does provide a robust understanding of the historicity of not only Islamic practices, but what we might think of as discourse in that Foucauldian sense more generally. This is, of course, drawing on the work, for those of you who know it, of Catholic theologian and philosopher Alistair MacIntyre. People haven't so much focused on the second half of the quotation, though, and that's what I want to emphasize here. So just rereading it again. Clearly not everything Muslims say and do belongs to an Islamic discursive tradition, nor is an Islamic tradition in this sense necessarily imitative of what was done in the past. For even where traditional practices appear to the anthropologist to be imitative of what has gone before, it will be the practitioner's conceptions of what is at performance and how the past is related to the present that will be crucial for tradition, not the apparent repetition of an old form. So put another way, what Asad essentially is saying here is that Islam, like any other discursive tradition, is not merely a matter of the social scientist's analysis and perception on the relationship between past, present, and future, but the historicity of the practitioners themselves, their own understanding of how they're relating past and futures. And now, my own intervention here, so in this context, anthropologists, social scientists, historians of Islam, it's incumbent upon us to examine the practitioner's own reflexivity and historicity within these discursive traditions. But the anthropology of secularism, as articulated by Assad and his followers, at least in my reading, has broadly focused more in a Foucauldian sense on secularism as a discipline and a sort of power knowledge that has categorized and caused conceptions and categories of religion to cohere in certain ways. And in some ways, Assad himself does a nice job of teasing out the Islamic discursive tradition in some of his earlier work, but there's been more of a focus on secularism in this Foucauldian vein as discipline power. I want to supplement that with a more dialectical reading of the relationship between Islam and other political cultural forms broadly. And so that's what this second slide is doing. So in the very simplistic classical sense, the dialectic understood as two initially distinct propositions, or in this case discourses, that then the thesis and antithesis, as it were, that then achieve synthetic mediations and points of intersection when they come into interaction with one another. So in this paper, I'm going to be talking in particular about three contextual mediations of Islam, that's what I'm calling them now, in Turkey, namely the mediation or dialectic of statism, the state tradition and Islam, the mediation or dialectic of populism, populist politics and Islam, and then finally, what's really my main object of interest and study in my broader project, the dialectic of civil society and Islam. Okay, I'm taking up a lot of time with introductory matters, I hope you'll bear with me. The second quotation, this is really an extraordinary quotation, I'll read it for you, perhaps some of you have seen it before. If sedentary societies, this is from Ernst Gellner, it says it's published in 1994. I think it must date from an earlier period, but still not that long ago. If sedentary societies are to be contrasted with civil society because the sub-communities on which they depend are too stifling for modern individualism, then Islam provides a further contrast. It exemplifies a social order which seems to lack much capacity to provide political countervailing institutions or associations, which is atomized without much individualism and operates effectively without intellectual pluralism. This is really striking. I would imagine that nowadays you're not going to find too many unreformed Orientalists who would subscribe to this sort of oil and water contrasting notion of Islam, but nonetheless, thinking about this issue of dialectics, this is a radically anti-dialectical approach to Islam, the notion that it can't synthesize creatively at all with civil society or democracy. And we find this still in certain quarters of academia, and certainly much more so in the popular media, which is where we'll go with the third opening quotation. So I've included this for two reasons. First, because I think it, perhaps three reasons. First, because Mr. Benedict XVI is no longer Pope, and that's been on my mind. Secondly, because this sort of encapsulates and exemplifies some of the what I would call the anti-dialectical approach to Islam that is often glossed as Islamophobia in the popular media. And then thirdly, because, as we'll see later in the paper, this actually becomes an ethnographic object in its own right for me. We're going to talk about a protest against Benedict in Turkey in 2006. But just to remind you, so this is Benedict prior to his to becoming pontiff. He gave a lecture, or actually was it prior? I can't recall now. I think it was just after he became he acceded to the papacy. gave a lecture at the University of Regensburg in Bavaria and quoted the Emperor Manuel Palaeologus II from the Byzantine era to the effect that, "Show me just what Muhammad brought that was new, and there you will find things only evil and inhuman, such as his command to spread by the sword the faith he preached." So again, keeping in mind both, for me of course this is crucial as an academic working on broad questions of Islam, the public sphere and politics, keeping in mind these rigidities that still circulate about Islam that also come to exist in very strange ways in our research context themselves, and so that's what I'll get to briefly. So all of that by way of a rather elongated introduction. I'm now going to move to my first ethnographic account, which takes place, ethnographic anecdote, which takes place in Thessaloniki, Greece. And I'm titling this "A Rare Sight of Nationalist, Secularist Homogeneity." On a blustery Aegean day in October 2006, I found myself lost in the labyrinth of streets and alleyways that form the old Ottoman district of Thessaloniki, frustrated by my search for the Turkish consulate. Though only passing through for the day with my brother, who had to renew his Turkish tourist visa, I had aspired to spend the afternoon in the city touring the birthplace and childhood home of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, founder of the modern Turkish Republic, which shares its grounds with the consulate. Initially, I had no luck in finding Atatürk's birthplace. The consulate is not included on any official map of Thessaloniki, an unsurprising omission perhaps given the historically fraught relationship between the two Eastern Mediterranean neighbors. Just as I was about to abandon my quest, however, I turned a corner and encountered a somewhat surreal sight. Scores of Turkish buses from all of the major private companies parked along both sides of a narrow lane. Flagging down a somewhat confused teenager from the Turkish city of Izmir, I inquired where I might find Atatürk's birthplace. Abi Atatürk'ün doğum evi nerede ya? And minutes later, I had joined the queue at the consulate, behind the busload of recent arrivals from Istanbul. Although it now resides in Greece, Atatürk's birthplace in Salonika, as it was known during Ottoman times, remains a primary site for the secularist nationalist pilgrimage for many Turks, second only to Anıtkabir, Atatürk's elaborate tomb complex in Ankara. I have an image of Anıtkabir there for you as well. That first image, incidentally, was on the left, was Atatürk's home. As you can tell, it's not especially obvious if you're walking by. And then we have a bust of Atatürk and the Turkish flag inside his childhood residence. We'll go back to Anıtkabir though. I was an enigma among the Turkish visitors to Atatürk's birthplace on that autumn afternoon, clearly. I was the only non-Turk, along with my brother, and several other of the visitors with whom I exchanged niceties stated unequivocally that they could not comprehend why a non-Turk would want to visit such a place. As a site of secularist pilgrimage and the ritual production of Turkish nationalism, Atatürk's birthplace, like Anıtkabir, enacts the political legerdemain of all nationalisms, the substitution of part for whole. In Turkey's case, the part that typically accedes to the privileged position of whole is Kemalism, or Atatürkçülük, the political project and elite culture of ethno-linguistically homogeneous secularism that has its roots in the late Ottoman and early Republican period. An overdetermined aesthetics of nationalism was both implicit and explicit at the site of Atatürk's nonage. The secularist pilgrims who had packed the coaches to Thessaloniki were hardly an accurate demographic representation of contemporary Turkish society. Most simply, they were wealthier and more urban and more urbane than many of their fellow citizens who would never think nor be able to make the journey to Thessaloniki. Together, the secularist pilgrims to Atatürk's birthplace embodied Turkey's Kemalist bourgeoisie, a demographically small elite that nevertheless frequently claims to inhabit and articulate the essential and definitive characteristics of the Turkish nation. These claims to absolute representativeness have grown all the more vociferous in recent decades, as the enforced identities of state and society, nation and people, language, religion, and citizenship have become all the more difficult to maintain in Turkey. Yet one would never recognize this in Thessaloniki. Atatürk's birthplace, excommunicated from the political geography of the Turkish nation proper, was one of the few places I visited during my research where the ideal of Turkish national homogeneity was not subject to interrogation. I'll give you another slide just to look at for a moment. We have the father figure staring down at us. So although it may already be obvious, one final characteristic, or rather characteristic lack, of the Turkish tourists to Thessaloniki deserves particular emphasis in this context. The visual cues of reform-oriented Sunni Islam, which are increasingly ubiquitous in Turkish public space, headscarves on women, beards, or the Islami bıyık, the Islamic mustache on men, sometimes skull caps, so forth, were entirely absent among the pilgrims to Ataturk's birthplace. If one were to evaluate the religiosity of Turks on the basis of this small sample, one might conclude that Mustafa Kemal's project of secularization, which entailed not merely the privatization and depoliticization of Islam, but also its gradual abolition from society at large, had succeeded. There's an overwhelming irony, at least to me, in the fact that this impression is now, or at least principally, possible outside of the political territory of Turkey itself. In every respect, geographically, aesthetically, politically, Ataturk's birthplace in Thessaloniki represents a margin and limit to my own study of the mediations and conjugations of Islam in contemporary Turkish life. This is simply because Ataturk's birthplace was the one place I ventured during my ethnography where Islam itself was a mere absence, even if, given modern Turkish history, this absence is always present as a sort of disavowed and repressed potential. So, thinking about the dialectical intervention that I'm making here, this is an anti-dialectical space in some way. Here we have a hegemonic vision of secularist nationalism that isn't really being contested, at least not in this site. And that's what I want to emphasize for this particular anecdote. So now we're going to move to the other metaphoric and indeed geographic bookend of my project. The village of Nurskoyu, Nurs village, which is located in the province of Bitlis in eastern Turkey, Turkish Kurdistan, and this section, an anecdote I'm calling Nostalgia for Unmediated, Authentic Piety. Less than a month following my trip to Thessaloniki, I huddled nervously in the front seat of a dusty 4x4 Toyota as it careened up a rough dirt road in the mountains that rise from the western edge of Lake Van en route to the village of Nurskoyu. In most respects, Nurskoyu is indistinguishable from any other Kurdish mountain village in eastern Turkey, home to several extended families that together comprise some 200 or 300 residents, too small to sustain even a state school or a market, both distant from and reliant on the larger towns and cities, small cities in its vicinity. In one important manner, however, Nurskoyu is unique. It was the birthplace of Bediuzzaman Said Nursi, arguably 20th century Turkey's most renowned theologian. Nursi's life and work span the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the Turkish Republic. Indeed, the eminent Turkish sociologist Shi'a Islam has famously argued that his theological corpus and reformation of Sunni Islam was both a reflection of and solution to the trials of this transition. So Said Nursi was born in 1878 CE in Nurskoyu and spent his childhood and adolescence studying in a variety of madrasas and other institutions of Islamic learning throughout Ottoman Kurdistan. In 1907, following his relocation to the imperial seat of Istanbul, he appealed to Sultan Abdülhamid II to open a trilingual Arabic-Kurdish-Turkish theological university in the province of Van. Nursi's fate was ultimately hinged, unsuccessfully I should note, if it wasn't already clear. Nursi's fate was ultimately hinged to the secularizing reforms of the early Turkish Republic, and he spent much of his later life in exile and imprisonment in spite of his own staunch rejection of politics as such. During his decades-long confinement, Nursi produced a massive work of tafsir, or Quranic commentary, entitled the Risale-i Nur, or Epistles of Light, which was copied by hand on the part of his disciples and circulated illegally among a nascent community of followers and enthusiasts. Following his death in 1960, the popularity of the Risale only continued to wax. Political and legal repression of the text and its enthusiasts eventually came to an end following the coup of 12 September 1980. Today, the Nur Community, or Nur Cemaatı, as it's known, is one of the largest and most vibrant Islamic networks in all of Turkey. Each week, some thousands of groups, ranging from a few participants to well over several hundred, gather throughout Turkey to read and learn from the Epistles of Light. There are separate classes, or dersler, for men and women, and in the context of my research, I participated regularly in some 5 or 6 classes in Istanbul, as well as being an esteemed guest to classes elsewhere whenever I would travel. Simultaneously, the Nur community has achieved representation within civil society as a variety of foundations and associations, and it was initially this civil articulation that attracted my own research interest. When my friend Faris Bey, the president of a major Nur institution in Istanbul, the Istanbul Science and Culture Foundation, learned that I was planning a 2-week trip to Turkish Kurdistan, he insisted that I travel to Nurskoyu in spite of its remote location. After I arrived in the small city of Tatvan on the western edge of Lake Van, I contacted the local acquaintance of Faris's, who immediately overwhelmed me with his hospitality. On the morning following my arrival, Ismail picked me up from my modest hotel in order to accompany me up to Nurskoyu. The treacherous 20-kilometer road took well over an hour to traverse. Upon our arrival, Ismail eagerly conveyed me on a brief tour of the village and surrounding area. The only recent construction, indeed the only gesture to architectural modernity whatsoever, was a small dershane, or classroom dormitory, which had been built by the very foundation I mentioned, the Istanbul Science and Culture Foundation, and funded by donations from its members. We then proceeded to Nursi's childhood home, which you see in this slide. A modest traditional adobe structure with a shared living space above a stable where a pair of goats and a clutch of pullets brayed and squawked. Finally, accompanied by a trail of village boys who had heard rumor of the unusual guest to the village, we visited the grave of Nursi's parents, an especially poignant sight for Nursi's enthusiasts due to the fact that the Turkish military buried his own earthly remains in an anonymous grave somewhere in the mountains of southwestern Anatolia. There's a lot to be said about this fact. Ostensibly, it was to prevent any possibility of ziyaret to a tomb complex of Nursi, though that said, Nursi himself said that it was the corpus, not he himself, that was the divine gift. And so he didn't want to be worshipped as a saint. But in any case, they buried his remains anonymously. And there I am with some young boys in the village, as you can see. One particular moment that afternoon punctuated my visit to Nurskoyu. As we stood in the living quarters that Nursi had inhabited as a child, and I'll go back, these are the living quarters themselves, my guide Ismail launched into a meditation on the space and its history. Can you imagine young Nursi sitting here on this very dirt floor, the sounds of the barnyard animals drifting through the open window, studying the Quran, the Hadith traditions, the works of the Sufis? Look around. There's still absolutely nothing here. Imagine how the village must have seemed over a century ago. And yet here, in this very modest house, a major theologian, Büyük bir alim, was born, began his studies. Amazing. Hayret bir şey. Reading between these reverent lines, we can detect an acute and peculiar nostalgia here. Implicitly, Ismail imagines Nursi's childhood piety and study to have been entirely unmediated, uninfluenced by the discourses and politics that surround and to a degree over-determine Islam in the contemporary Turkish context. Clearly, he both admires and longs for the sort of unmediated, authentic piety that he imagines Nursi to have experienced in the bucolic idyll of Nurskoyu during the twilight years of the Ottoman Empire. And yet, such an unmediated, unproblematic piety is a fantasy, an unattainable object that marks another margin and limit. While Ataturk's birthplace in Thessaloniki represents the dream of an absolute occlusion of Islam from Turkish modernity, Nurskoyu in the southeastern Turkish province of Bitlis represents the aspiration for an unmediated, unpoliticized, authentic Islamic piety that bears no imprint of the project of Turkish modernization and secularization at all. In this sense, both Thessaloniki and Nurskoyu, as polar fantasies, are metaphorical bookends to the contemporary politics of Islam in Turkey and hence to my own project. The fact that they're separated by some 1,500 kilometers, the bulk of Turkey itself, including, of course, Istanbul, Ankara, and the other major metropolises, only underscores their property as coordinating margins to this study. So, again, just setting it up, I think it's clear, but on the one hand, we have this deeply secularist, modernizing, anti-religious nationalism that really only achieves unproblematic representation outside of Turkey and Thessaloniki. I mean, there are other sites in Turkey where you could find it, but I've chosen this one for the sake of the paper. On the other hand, this sort of nostalgia for unmediated rural piety that we find in this context And these are sort of the limits of what I'm doing. They are, in some sense, they mark both geographically and discursively where I want to take the project. So now we're going to move to the mediations and dialectics themselves. First, I need some water. So now we have the third ethnographic anecdote, which focuses on the Diyanet İşleri Başkanlığı, or the Directorate of Religious Affairs in Ankara. And I'm titling this Bureaucratic Islam of and for the State. On a May afternoon in 2006, I boarded one of the swarm of minibuses that hover around Güven Park in Kızılay, Ankara's central business district, and headed west toward Turkey's Directorate of Religious Affairs, Diyanet İşleri Başkanlığı, which you see the very anonymous-looking bureaucratic sign announcing it here in this photo. While most of Ankara's state ministries are located near the city center, the Directorate of Religious Affairs maintains its own sprawling campus on Ankara's western fringe, a testament to both its size and importance. It's the largest single-state bureaucracy in Turkey, and its relative independence from Ankara's other governmental bureaucracies. The campus of the Directorate itself is a sprawling conglomeration of 6-story high office buildings scattered over several square kilometers. As so often is the case in Turkey, and indeed elsewhere for that matter, architecture offers immense lessons to the attentive social scientist. The buildings that house the Directorate of Religious Affairs are indistinguishable from those of any other state bureaucracy in Ankara and bear no trace whatsoever of the Islamic architectural tradition. A somewhat reductive reading of this architecture is nonetheless suggestive. Religion, in this context, is subservient to the demands and logics of the state. My appointment on that afternoon was with Mehmet Gormez, professor of theology at Ankara University, and at the time one of the several upper-level assistants to the head of the directorate. In November 2010, providentially for me, Gormez acceded to the head of the directorate himself, making him the single highest officially recognized Islamic authority in Turkey. Mehmet Bey and I spoke over requisite tea for approximately 45 minutes in his spacious office. Our conversation was rather sedate and scripted. He outlined the history and functions of the Directorate of Religious Affairs and emphasized its non-partisan, ostensibly non-political character. Mehmet Bey bristled noticeably when I presented him with the standard criticism of the Directorate on the part of Turkey's minority Alevi Muslims, namely that it actively favors Sunni Islam to the detriment of Alevism. He responded with no small degree of indignation that the Directorate of Religious Affairs is, quote, above all sects, Sunni and Alevi, and that in any case, Alevism is more of a culture than a religion, kültür rather than din. Finally, as our interview came to a close, Mehmet Bey offered me an alarming and disheartening piece of advice. Quote, I wanted to tell you something as a fellow researcher. Your project is on the wrong path. You're interested in civil society, and religious communities, cemaatler, tarikatlar, but you can't learn about Islam from these sorts of things. If you want to understand Islam, study its history, its texts. What you're studying won't really teach you anything. It's merely politics. End quote. So at the time, I was upset and disconcerted by this casual rejection of my research project, perhaps understandably. I'm sure many of us have had comparable moments. In the coming weeks, I related these comments to various friends and research contexts from different civil society organizations and NGOs, and consistently met with a nod and a sympathetic smile. The general response seems to be, what did you expect? Of course, that's what an official from Diyanet would tell you. Upon reflection in the several years since this conversation, I've also come to appreciate the fascinating presuppositions about the relationship among Islam, state practice, and citizenship summarized by Mehmet Bey's remarks, and characteristic of the Directorate of Religious Affairs activities more broadly. In brief, the Directorate of Religious Affairs as the primary institutional site for the state production and regulation of Islam in Turkey broadcasts a privatized, individualized, and most crucially, depoliticized mode of religiosity. It's really a state service model, just as society has a need for something like water or health insurance, so too does it have a need for religion, and the state should provide. So the Directorate's rendering of Islam is homogeneous, text-based, and reliant upon a static, singular interpretation of Islamic tradition, while the authority of the Islam that the Directorate of Religious Affairs produces and fosters is guaranteed by its relationship to the state. The Directorate, like the Turkish state generally, imagines the relationship between citizen and pious practitioner as a hierarchical one. The obligations and privileges of citizenship demand a mode of religion that is subservient to it and the state. So again, this service model, I think, is a good way to understand this. Mehmet-based summary of the Director of Religious Affairs activities and aspirations was a verbatim citation of the constitutional provision for the institution. He emphasized the Directorate's three distinct functions, quoting directly from the constitutional clause related to Diyanet. Quote, to carry out affairs related to the beliefs, prayers, and moral foundations of Islam, to enlighten society about religion, and to manage places of prayer, mosques. The Constitution also underscores the institution's transcendence of political particularity. Quote, the Directorate of Religious Affairs, which is within the general administration, shall exercise its duties prescribed in its particular law in accordance with the principle of secularism, removed from all political views and ideas, and aiming at national solidarity and integrity, end quote. Very constitutional language, as I'm sure you can tell. Historically, the Directorate of Religious Affairs dates from the early years of the Turkish Republic and thus embodies the spirit of the laicist reforms that marked the Republic's departure from the Ottoman Empire. It was designed as the synthesis of two Ottoman ministries, the Ministry of Efkaf, or Pious Endowments, Vakıflar, and the Ministry of Sharia, or Sharia, including the office of the Sheikh al-Islam, at the time the supreme clerical authority in Sunni Islam. Simultaneous with the abolition of these two Ottoman ministries in March 1924, the Directorate of Religious Affairs was created as an administrative department under the Prime Ministry in order to manage all religious affairs in the nascent republic. Importantly, the sequestration of religion within a single bureaucratic body allowed for the more thorough secularization of Turkish law and politics generally, achieved chiefly through the whole cloth barring of Swiss civil law and the Italian penal code. So this is my presentation on Diyanet, the Directorate of Religious Affairs. What I want to emphasize here is that we have one mediation, and in particular mediation of a very modern state project and the Islamic discursive tradition occurring here within this institution. And what it produces is this very homogenized, text-based, streamlined orthodoxy that is taken to be necessarily non-political and should be privatized. It's a service provided to the citizens. And now, clearly, the aspiration of the Turkish state was in some sense to monopolize the production of Islam, and you might say that indeed it achieved that to some degree in the early years of the Republic. But there are politicized modes of Islamic identity in Turkey that are not state-based, and that's where we're moving to next. So, namely, the fourth ethnographic anecdote that I have for you. What have I called this? Islam as mass spectacle and partisan sensibility. Islam, I've written two different things. Islamist identity as populist mass spectacle, partisan mobilization, and protest. So think back now to Benedict XVI and the quotation I read at the beginning, because this is a protest against Benedict. Hagia Sophia is a mosque and will always be a mosque. Hagia Sophia is ours and will always be ours. Devious and ignorant Pope, don't come here. Shoulder to shoulder against oppression. God is great. I milled through a thick crowd of young men. The women demonstrators were located in a separate area behind us on the hill, that filled Istanbul's Çağlayan Square in the cool November morning. The protest had been organized by the Felicity Party, Saadet Partisi, a right-wing Islamist party against the imminent arrival of Pope Benedict XVI to Turkey. A few months earlier, as I mentioned before, during a lecture at the University of Regensburg, Benedict ignited a political firestorm by favorably quoting the Islamophobic remarks made by Byzantine Emperor Emmanuel Palaeologus II. Show me just what Muhammad brought that was new, and there you will find things only evil and inhuman, such as his command to spread by the sword the faith he preached. Benedict's comments were greeted with anger and indignation by Muslim commentators both in Turkey and around the globe, and interpreted as another provocation aimed at creating a clash between Christian European civilization and Islam, of a piece with the Danish cartoon controversy of 2005. Although Benedict's primary purpose in traveling to Turkey was to meet with Patriarch Bartholomew, the head of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate in Istanbul, and the Vatican indeed framed his courtesy call as an historic opportunity for reconciliation between the Western and Eastern churches, Benedict also hopes to mend fences with the Muslim world at large during his first visit as Pope to a Muslim-majority nation. For this reason, Benedict held tete-a-tete meetings with Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Ali Bardakoglu was the head of Diyanet at the time and the chief mufti of Istanbul during his sojourn. He also toured both Ayasofya and the Blue Mosque, Sultan Ahmet Cami, while in Istanbul. Nonetheless, many Turkish Muslims, as well as much of the populist conservative Islamic press, such as the newspapers Vakit and Yeni Shafak, were unimpressed and unpersuaded by Benedict's gestures of goodwill. Several days prior to his arrival, a group of young men associated with a different right-wing nationalist party, the Great Unity Party, or Birlik Partisi, performed prayers in the Ayasofya Museum specifically to protest Benedict's visit. A notable public provocation because it marshaled prayer in order to criticize and interrogate both Benedict's Christian appropriation of Ayasofya as a church and the state secularist definition of Ayasofya as a museum rather than a mosque. The demonstration in Çağlayan Square was conceived as a similar mass outpouring of popular sentiment against Benedict. Reportedly, the Felicity Party arranged buses to convey demonstrators to Istanbul from every province of Turkey, although the approximately 20,000 demonstrators in attendance was a far cry from the million expected. So I have a whole bevy of slides from this demonstration, but I'll pause on this one for a moment. I milled about Çağlayan Square as the assembled crowd awaited the keynote addresses from Recai Kutan, the head of the Felicity Party, and former Welfare Party Prime Minister Necmettin Erbakan, the now deceased Eminence Gri, of political Islamism in Turkey. Hundreds of banners and posters, both homemade and mass-produced, hovered above the crowd. Together, they commented dryly on the perceived hypocrisy of Benedict himself and Christianity more generally. Among the slogans I noticed, some in English, some in Turkish, were the following. We believe in Jesus. Do you believe in Muhammad? The Inquisition, no comment. The Crusades, that was a peaceful walk. We do not want a Vatican here. This is Istanbul, not Constantinople. So I have a few more slides for you. This just says, in order to say stop to those who insult or extend a tongue against Islam and the Prophet, we say don't come. We'll leave it on that one for a moment. I think the aesthetics of this are in some ways themselves instructive. Where was I? In spite of the small Turkish flag that I had been given while passing through the security checkpoint at the edge of the demonstration, I clearly cut a strange figure among the protesters and was often challenged with unsolicited questions on my opinion of Benedict. Eventually, I struck up a conversation with Adem, an enthusiastic young man who identified himself as a member of the Felicity Party youth faction. Echoing the sentiments of many of the placards, Adem expressed a deep concern and anger over what he perceived to be a long history of aggression toward Islam on the part of the West, Batı, spanning from the Crusades to Benedict's recent provocation. Both Kutan and Erbakan reiterated this monolithic history of Western aggression in their official statements, broadcast from the stage through a PA system. Although they were at some pains to reconcile the Turkish tradition of hospitality, misafirperverlik, gelenek, with their hostility to Benedict's arrival, they each contextualized the protest within a broader litany of complaints, including American President George W. Bush's ostensible war against Islam, and recent or ongoing conflicts in Bosnia, Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, and Chechnya. The governing Justice and Development Party, which shares its political roots with the Felicity Party, was also criticized for acquiescence to Benedict's visit. In an especially remarkable gesture, one of the speakers urged the demonstrators to flood a government telephone line with text messages simply reading, "The Pope shouldn't come, Papa gelmesin." All about me, cell phones emerged, and digits dexterously fulfilled the speaker's request. The spectacle of religiously informed indignation that greeted me at Çağlayan Square was yet another mediation of Islam in contemporary Turkey, one that is a world away from the state homogeny of bureaucratic status Islam that I described earlier. This mass Islam is familiar even to casual consumers of American and European news media. Arguably, it's the only conjugation of Islamic identity suited to the spectacular needs of the 24-hour news cycle. Yet the relationship between such moments of coordinated, crowd-based protest and what we tend to think of as the discursive traditions and constituent practices of Islam is itself difficult, at least for me, to comprehend. The demonstration at Charlemagne Square immediately called to mind both sociological and anthropological theories of the crowd as a definitively modern political subject. Here I'm thinking of Gustave Le Bon's work in particular, as well as Guy Debord's influential concept of the spectacle and its intimate relationship to modern mass political and public life. At a lull near the middle of the demonstration, Arden proposed that we go together to a nearby mosque to pray, but this gesture toward ritual practice was rather detached from the protest itself. So 2 points I think are crucial here. First, contrary to homogeneous hegemonic media portrayals, populist politicized Islam, which I think we too easily call Islamism, is but one contemporary mediation of Islam among many, both in Turkey and elsewhere. Secondly, in order to comprehend this Islamism, we must examine the other contextual mediations of Islamic identity and practice in specific contexts. So in the case of Turkey, there are 2 other principal mediations, at least in my paper today, namely the statist Islam that I described earlier, and now, finally, the object of my own research, civil Islam, which we'll move to next. So this is now the 5th anecdote, and as I'm calling it, the 3rd dialectic. Civil Islam and liberal humanism. The massive theater and conference hall of the Cemal Reşit Rey Concert Salon, conference hall, located in the buzzing Istanbul neighborhood of Harbiye, was packed to the rafters with audience members, both Turkish and foreign, all attendees of the International Conference on Hunger and Poverty, Uluslararası Açlık ve Yoksulluk Konferansı. The stage at Reşit Rey featured a fascinating tableau. To each side, massive black and white photographs of desperate, starving children, each of clearly distinct ethnic and national origins, let me turn to this for a moment, hovered several feet above the stage itself. Near the center of the stage, 6 children, also tokens of ethno-national diversity, stood solemnly as ethereal instrumental music played over the theater's PA system. To the right, the MC, a middle-aged man, recited a poem on the tragedy of poverty. Slowly, the children moved toward the photographs and began to flip them over. Color images of smiling, healthy children replaced the photos of dire, hungry children in black and white. Above the stage, a banner depicted the 3 Abrahamic religions in the coexist fashion that I'm sure we're all familiar with from bumper stickers, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam with their stereotypical icons, the Star of David, the cross, and the crescent moon. This surreal pageant lasted for about 10 minutes before the roster of speakers for the conference was introduced. For the next several hours, those of us in the audience listened to a rather repetitive speeches by representatives from Turkey's Greek Orthodox, Syriac Orthodox, Armenian Catholic, and Jewish communities, along with several Sunni Turks. The content of these speeches was streamlined and homogeneous. Religious individuals and institutions have an obligation to work together to end hunger and poverty, particularly that of children, throughout the globe. So with this tableau from the Conference on Global Poverty in mind, we finally now arrive at the primary object of my own ethnographic study, which really isn't the object of this presentation today, namely the recent striking emergence of discourses and practices of liberal humanism among Islamic civil society organizations in contemporary Turkey. To appreciate the specificity and resonances of this Islamic humanism, we have first had to take into account the entire political and social topography of Islam in Turkey today. The hegemonic secularist nationalism evident at Ataturk's birthplace in Thessaloniki, and the nostalgic, unmediated rural piety of pre-republican Morskoyu, in a sense, constitute the margins and borders of this topography. The statist bureaucratic orthodoxy of the Directorate of Religious Affairs and the mass spectacle of the demonstration against Pope Benedict XVI are 2 of this topography's major features. The most striking tectonic transformation in this topography in recent years, however, has surely been, at least in my opinion, the efflorescence of Turkish Islamic civil society and the discourses of liberal humanism that have accompanied and coordinated it. So, in some sense now, if I had you for the rest of the afternoon, I would delve into all of the different institutions and particular mediations of Islam and liberalism that are occurring on the basis and within these different civil society organizations. I'll give you just a sense of them. You've probably, I saw that the latest Turkish review had Neo-Ottomanism as its topic. So Neo-Ottomanism is something on the minds of many, especially those interested in the geopolitics of the Levant. We have a sort of emergence of a very potent neo-Ottoman aesthetics within these civil society foundations as well. This is the Rustem Pasha Medresesi, which was in fact built by, or rather designed by Mimar Sinan, the famous architect from the era of Suleiman the Magnificent. It was in, I think there's a lot of potency in this particular story. It was abandoned and in disrepair for most of the Republican period until this Istanbul Science and Culture Foundation, which I mentioned earlier, made a proposal to the Ministry of Foundations in Ankara to renovate it with private funds, and so now it's in the state that you see. Yet another aspect of all of this, and something that deserves more than its own presentation, is the way in which Alevism, which I've discussed before, has emerged really within civil society as a sort of, in some sense, classic civil rights movement. Here you get very interesting syntheses. So you see here you have the Turkish flag, Ali, and then Mustafa Kemal himself. So Mustafa Kemal as a figure becomes integrated into these new institutional formations of Islam, even as he also is representative of this more sort of hegemonic nationalism. So we could talk all sorts about that. But finally, by way of a conclusion, and I know I've kept you probably too long already, one last short anecdote. On a torrid July afternoon in 2008, a year and a half following the end of my field research proper, I retreated from the sweltering Chicago humidity into the cool, refreshing lobby of one of the high-rises along Michigan Avenue, on Chicago's famous Miracle Mile. After taking the elevator up some 20 floors, I entered the suite of the Niagara Foundation, an NGO that's loosely attached to Hizmet, or the Gülen movement broadly. The vice president of the foundation, Hakan Bey, and I spoke for over an hour in a melange of English and Turkish while sharing a plate of baklava and staring out over the hypnotic waters of Lake Michigan. Our conversation veered among many unrelated topics, from local Chicago politics to my impressions of Istanbul. Finally, near the end of our chat, I asked Hakan Bey to compare the situation of the Niagara Foundation to that of Islamic civil society institutions in Turkey itself. His response was quite telling. Quote, "In Turkey, politics is inescapable, but here we just don't have to worry about this at all. We are able to pursue our philanthropic goals without entering into those terrible debates." End quote. Now, it would be easy, I think, to end with Hakan Bey's sort of almost triumphant notion of what it means to be a religious civil society organization outside of Turkey and in the United States in particular. And in some sense, it does indeed, in a way, transcend or perhaps synthesize a lot of these dialectical contradictions that I've been discussing within Turkey itself, precisely because it's now, again, outside of the geography of Turkey proper. But that said, all sorts of other things are going on in this globalized context, and the globalized, as we all know, is always localized. And so I chose these images just minutes before coming down here, so they're not entirely strategic, but you can see the sort of strange juxtapositions of the Turkish and American flag, the way that you intervene in political debates. You have condemnations of both the attack in Benghazi and then also more recently the smaller event in Ankara. And so there's yet more to be said about all of this, but with that, I'll leave it to you to ask me some questions.
Thanks, Jeremy, for this stimulating talk, and I will leave it to you to field the questions if you don't mind.
Of course.
Hi, I'm Susay. I'm a first year in the Master of Science in Foreign Service program here. Thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you could go into a little more what you mean by liberal humanism in Islamic civil society. I'm not sure if I misunderstood you, but are you primarily talking about the Gülen movement? And if so, kind of, I guess when I think of liberal humanism, kind of, that's a more secular concept, if I'm not mistaken. I wouldn't call the Gülen movement a secular movement, so yes.
Well, thank you for that question. Indeed, this is precisely the sort of presuppositions that I'm, in a way, destabilizing with some of my research. I'm not merely referring to the Gülen movement, though my example was indeed from an institution affiliated with Hizmet, but rather to what I take to be a broad swath of different Islamic civil society organizations. I want to be a bit careful because I'm not going to claim that all Islamic NGOs, Vakıf and Dernekler, are equally somehow liberal. But what I mean by it very simply is a commitment to a political principle of choice based on an individual level in matters of lifestyle and in particular in religion. And this is something that one encounters constantly in the sort of self-explanations and discourse of all of these institutions, whether it be Alevi or Sunni, Gülen, Nur, so on and so forth. So it's in some ways a relatively loose and therefore perhaps not entirely satisfying definition of liberalism, and this is something that I negotiate quite a lot in my other work, which again, in some sense, this was all just a prolegomena to that. But wanting to sort of frame it in the terms that I've given in the talk today, wanting to understand how there is indeed a synthetic moment of a dialectical moment in which Islam as a series of practices and communities is coming to coexist and indeed be influenced by and influence liberal commitments to questions of citizenship and religious choice. And that's certainly occurring in Turkey. The Gülen movement has, of course, taken on the standard, in some sense, the ensign of this, and made it a global network. And in doing so has attracted all sorts of suspicion, which itself deserves both mention and probably further question. But that's briefly what I mean when I invoke it. I'm fielding questions. Okay, Sylvia, sorry, I forgot that I was responsible. Sylvia, we'll go down the table and then back up to Osama.
Just a quick little point of clarification. At one point you mentioned that the Niagara group was loosely attached to the Gülen movement. It would be wonderful if there was a litmus test that really gave a ratings on a scale of attachment. Do you have any such?
I do not have a litmus test, and in fact, you're right to point out that the adverb there is problematic, because exactly what the network or the movement, Hizmet, is now, I constantly debate with the Gülen folk what they prefer to be called. So the first debate, this is a somewhat tangential response to the question. The first debate had to do with questions of tariqat or brother, Sufi brotherhood as a label, which they absolutely reject. Then it was Cemaat. Are we best called a Cemaat or a community? Well, that seemed more appropriate, and yet it was also taken up in certain press organs in Turkey as a term that they found they were uncomfortable with, and they thought was indeed a bit derogatory. So then they went to Hareket, or movement, but now they just prefer Hizmet, which in certain ways has analogies to Dava in other parts of the Islamic world. But no, there is no litmus test. I will refer you, actually I'll refer you afterward to a young sociologist, a fellow, well, I'll refer all of you, to Joshua Hendrick at the University of Maryland, who's doing really, his work focuses explicitly on the Gülen movement as a global, I think he calls it a global postmodern network, and it doesn't focus on Turkey per se, but rather on the arrangement of media companies, private businesses, civil society foundations, and schools, of course, the Gülen movement being known especially for the Turkish schools that you find in so many different corners of the globe. So, brief answer, no, I don't have a litmus test, but there are those who would be more qualified to answer that. Yes, I saw a question here.
Hi, Casey Evans. I was just wondering, has there been a shift or a change in these dialectics that you've witnessed with the continued electoral success of AKP, especially the first dialectic, Islam of and for the state?
That's a very good question, and I both while conducting my research and then also while sort of summoning it to a writerly state, I've in some ways avoided the AKP, and there were a number of strategic reasons for that while I was doing research. But in the moment that I described to you, the protest against Benedict XVI, this is not the AKP or the Justice and Development Party. This is the Felicity Party, which is much more of a classic sort of Islamist, I use the term with some hesitation, Islamist party, which because it really doesn't have any shot at electoral success, can occupy that sort of spectacular space in in public life. The AKP has certainly, is another, if you want, sort of moment of mediation or dialectic that I don't get into. I assume most of us are relatively familiar with specific comprehensions of Islam in these particular civil society organizations. Jihan Tual, whom I've already mentioned, has made some of these arguments about political Islam and the AKP in particular, but I'll just say yes as a brief answer, because indeed you might think of this as the privatization. Although, again, I wouldn't want the privatization of piety, you might say, but I wouldn't want to push that too far, because again, it's not merely a commodity that's bought and sold by private firms, and it relies on, whether it's the Alevis or the Nur Cemaatı, their historicities and the discursive traditions that they're drawing on are not reducible to that model. But in a very structural sense, I think there's a lot there. Sylvia, did you have another?
Just the dialectic with the visit to Salonika, there are Greek buses that bring wedding parties directly to the Patriarchate in Istanbul. Do not stop, do not drink Turkish coffee.
The anti-dialectic.
What would happen is, if there's a bus stop and these two buses meet, could they actually get
right on the border at Edirne, probably. That's great.
But could I ask you to go back to the slide that shows the mausoleum, because I wasn't
sure. Yes. It's not a classic image of Nur Cemaatı, but it's one that I took myself and I rather like because it's looming.
Which one is it? Is it the one?
It's here.
What kind of structure is that? It looks like a box.
It's a Hittite-inspired neoclassical mausoleum. I think that's about right. There is supposedly some notion of a pre-Islamic Anatolian architectural tradition that somehow is integrated here. This is on the cover of all sorts of books nowadays, both Jenny White's new book and then a great book by my friend Christopher Dole called Healing Secular Life. Both feature Nur Cemaatı on the cover. Dole's book has a young child who is on his circumcision parade, the Sunnet.
On the one, what kind of dialectic are we talking about? It seems to me that it's certainly not dialectic materialism.
No.
But so on the other hand, then, are you talking about a kind of idealist dialectic whereby the notion of mediation then is internally itself contradictory between on the one hand an ideal type of Islam, for example, through which the facts can be, or reality can be mediated. Let me put this in another way, actually in a more straightforward way. When you pick these two sites of mediation, the populist movements or the demonstrations on the one hand, and the state institution, the DNet, right? Now the question that arises on an almost intuitive level, why are these called mediation? Why are these the sites of mediation rather than, say, for example, the house of, what's his name, the theologian?
Nursi.
Right? Why not that also a mediating space or site? So then the next thought would be that by pointing or selecting these two sites as mediating sites, you seem to presuppose an ideal type, a kind of fixed tradition of what Islam is, that is distinct from these, that's pure and distinct really from these mediated forms.
Well, there are many different ways that I can answer this question, and we'll have to hash it out. This is always the way to address questions that you're not fully comfortable, confident in answering. But the whole point of, so the reason that I've chosen dialectic and mediation as a theoretical intervention in this material is because I have come up against the limits of a certain Foucauldian type of discourse analysis and genealogy, which is to say that as an understanding of secularism in that Assadian vein, and now I'm perhaps talking to you most specifically, since I know you're also deeply immersed in this literature, but I find the sort of Foucauldian moves very helpful to understand how secularism produces a sort of power, knowledge, category, and concept of religion, and how this is not merely about sort of separating out religion as some always already essential domain, but producing it in certain ways. However, when I try to think through what Assad has done vis-a-vis my own material, that sort of analysis doesn't get me as far as I want to go, which is to say that introducing dialectic as a concept helps me to understand how something that again, it's not dialectical materialism, and perhaps it's a very loose and not very satisfying invocation of dialectic, but in the most abstract sense, sort of thesis, antithesis, two domains that we tend to think of, or I shouldn't include you in me, as separate, a state tradition and an Islamic discursive tradition are achieving synthetic integration and then producing in that moment an understanding of Islam that may seem essentialist or ideal, typical in that moment, but are always the effects of that mediation. And so when you have something like Diyanet, the Directorate of Religious Affairs, you're getting a very different articulation of Islam based on state tradition and then the textual tradition and a variety. I mean, you'd have to do a very deep history of this to really get to the texture, but I'm just suggesting a sort of conceptual architecture. You get a very different mediation there than you do in these civil society organizations or in the more populist political protests. And so that's really what I want to get at, because I've found myself frustrated in a certain way with the limits of Foucauldian analysis of secularism, even as I'm also deeply inspired and immersed in it. Now, more specifically, why isn't Nur Koyu and this, we can get back to it here, the childhood home of Said Nursi a site of mediation? Well, it is a site of mediation in some sense. The very invocation of an authentic, nostalgic sort of nostalgia is a mediation of some sense. Certainly, and indeed, Esra Özürek is another name, Yarın Barış. And we can go through the whole roster of Turkish anthropologists who've dealt with some of these things. In the sense that Ismail, whom I was speaking with there, is certainly mediating a lot of things when he's evoking and valorizing some notion of this rural piety. But he presents it as non-mediated. So that's sort of what's interesting in that moment. I deal with some of these sort of again, this is a bit abstract and perhaps jargony, but the mediated production of unmediated concepts of religion. Yeah, you're raising your finger, yes.
Yeah, I can't help thinking about the more you speak, the more I find the notion of deterritorialization, which actually might conflict with the temporal dialectic, because it's a geographical spatial notion, right? So, you know, if you find the Foucauldian framework unsatisfactory, why resort to a Hegelian notion rather than the Guattari's and deterritorialization?
I'll buy you a coffee. But the Deleuze-Guattari deterritorialization I find to be very provocative as an intervention within a relatively parochial tradition of Western philosophy, but not very good as a tool for social and political analysis. And maybe that's just my own frustration with a certain looseness to that concept. And so perhaps even including the word already, sets me off in some sort of direction that I probably shouldn't go. But
so you don't see it, sorry, but just you don't see the deterritorialization of Islam taking place within Turkey, actually, such as in these places.
That is a question that deserves
We'll talk about this later.
Deserves more meditation, more mediation.
No more questions? All right. Well, thank you again very much.
Thank you.